Hello and welcome to the J Plus R Movie Podcast. And this week we're going to be changing it up a little bit by not actually discussing a movie. We're going to be discussing a season or a series, as we call it over here in the UK, specifically of the show Luther, created by Neil Cross and starring Idris Elba in all 5 seasons so far.
This season concerns Luther hunting down a killer who's murdering most of the women across London. It also concerns a returning villain, George Cornelius, hunting for his son, and Luther being pulled into the mix with all of that. And it's about Luther trying to keep these two strands of his life from both ruining his own personal life and from interfering with each other, while he also has to deal with an unexpected visitor at the end of the first episode.
I think we should probably run down what we thought of the previous seasons.
This was one of those shows that I just adore. It's dark, gritty mystery every time, and Luther's the unstable genius character, but they threw in way more unstable than usual. So he always seems like a breath away from doing something really screwed up. I think to see the lengths that he will go to, and kind of the places that he'll see while he still can't help but care about the character, because he's portrayed as someone who really does care. I would actually argue that he's less about solving the puzzle than he's stopping the criminal.
I agree with that. I would say in terms of what I thought of the seasons, like specifically, I quite liked series 1 and series 3. I think those are definitely the best.
I would argue the first series is the best, personally.
Series 1 to me, breath of fresh air amongst the fairly oversaturated crime show. I know in the US, obviously, it's saturated, but over here it's just as saturated. There are so many different shows, and this one immediately stood out because it managed to create a really, really interesting lead who's interesting for the reasons that you pointed out, and also managed to create a really interesting reoccurring villain, that of the Alice character, a deranged psychopath, but also kind of had that loyal and humane quality that makes them very interesting to watch despite their bad ways. And that definitely was a really strong element of series 1, because apart from this season, that's the one where she's in it the most. Series 1 to me also had a really engaging personal plot regarding Luther's wife and his best friend, and how both of those things get screwed up. Series 3, I think, also kind of raised the personal stakes quite a lot, introduced one of the most interesting villains of any of the seasons, and it ended on this really great now what ending. He set up a really interesting potential follow-up, but also would have worked as an ending in its own right.
I think that did work quite well, to be fair, season 3 ending, because it was just so big. It was it had a major character death and a major turn-back event. I think it left the characters in different places than they would be. I mean, Luther leaving the police was quite a big thing to have happen.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I kind of felt that series 4 was by far the weakest so far. And that's partially because they unfortunately kind of had to reset the status quo. They had to just bring Luther back. They had to put him against another evil killer. They mostly just kind of got rid of the really interesting setup that they had. As a return, it was just quite underwhelming. This season is a lot better, and it did sort of address how I felt about series 4. It's dealing with him in a personal way that kind of addresses what happened in between series 3 and series 4.
Especially with how Alice is treated in this series, because it should be mentioned, I think, now that Alice does come back. He's now got a different relationship with her than he ever did before. It's more personal. He did cross that line into personal boundaries, which he hadn't done previously. So she almost has the ability to compromise him further than he's been compromised before.
In the episode where we flash back to what they were doing, so they went to a different country entirely, and you even see in the flashback that they actually consummated the sexual romantic tension that they've had. You see them just straight up having sex, and that is a big thing, because it's showing that they actually acted on these feelings that had been only kind of hinted at beforehand. And then we kind of get the official reason as to why Luther ended up coming back to England as well. It's basically the kind of standard hero thing of, if I wasn't there, then people would still be alive. And what that then leads to with this season is much more a personal story where Alice is almost trying to hold on to that connection that they used to have, and Luther just pushing her away.
She's quite tinged with a bit of regret about having that sort of personal connection. Alice starts going a bit more off the rails towards the end of it. I mean, even for her, she's always had this weird sort of attachment to him, but now it's kind of been taken to another level. I don't think that kind of gets any more obvious when Alice shoots Halliday.
That was a really shocking moment. I really did not expect that. That was really good. Like, in the final episode, she basically just kind of snaps.
Throughout the series, she just wants him to go with her, and he's against that because he couldn't stay away because he's worried about what would happen. And then it's kind of the whole cat and mouse game that they kind of usually play, especially as the series went on. And to see him decide that he's not going to take that and decide, and her just turn around at the end of it and go, all right, well, then I'm moving on from this. And I mean, she shoots him like twice, 3 times. Quite a role reversal to what she'd normally do.
Especially because, like, in a couple of instances, she's even assisted and saved his life on a few occasions. It's one of the most, like, noteworthy aspects of this season is how they kind of treat that relationship. And the way that they end it, I felt was very emotional. Like, there was this sort of sadness to Alice's presumed death, because we don't quite know that she's dead.
She's got to be pretty dead.
Yeah, she's either dead or in a coma.
Yeah, because it really does mirror the first episode drop of Henry Madsen. To be fair, it would have been a good way to end it. I mean, I know they've got a film coming out. It's being shot at the moment, but honestly, they could have just ended it there and it would have been fine.
Maybe, but I have to say that what this season definitely did do is that it did make me curious to see where the story would go on from here. Like almost literally, like with the situation that happens with the dangling off of the ledge, it is a cliffhanger ending. It would have been really dark. Do you kind of prefer the idea of there being a film? Sounds like good as a continuation. Sure, I'm trying to like clear his name. And maybe Alice is just in a coma or something. I don't know. I did really like how the series ended. And to move back a little bit as well, I thought that there was quite a good parallel drawn between that relationship and the killer of the season and his relationship with his wife.
His wife was very much an enabler of his bad behaviour, and she almost seemed somewhat in denial about what her role in it was.
An enabler, but also doesn't want him to do it, but doesn't want him to do it not because it's immoral, but because it's bringing forth attention. Even though it's a husband and wife relationship, it's almost like sort of twisted mother-son.
Like he was a lost child that she was looking after rather than her husband. It was quite interesting to see her, almost deny any sort of knowledge of it, even when it was proven. But I think it was also quite interesting that she did in the end turn on him when she realised that she'd have consequences herself.
The way I viewed that was she basically just, at that point, thought to herself, there's no way to save him. He's just going to keep on doing this, so I might as well let what's coming to him happen. It's also clear as well that she couldn't really get out of the situation either, because by that point she had tried to kill one of his hostages, one of the women that he had kidnapped as well. He kidnapped a woman and then she discovered her, and then she basically tried to kill her herself. But the way it's sort of played, it almost seems like a bit of a mercy kill.
It didn't seem as purely psychopathic as Jeremy's actions did, but it was still like, I think it was that moment where she realised how culpable she'd now become.
I think it was an attempt to get rid of evidence as well.
One thing I do want to speak about is Benny. It all seemed quite normal, but then seeing Benny get more involved in Luther's personal life, you kind of have this sense of inevitable dread until it all went completely wrong, and the way that only Luther really does go wrong.
He's always been the one unconditionally supportive figure in Luther's life. Even though he's kind of a professional, he's also genuinely always helped him out. But we see that put to the test in this season. He then gets kidnapped. And then, like, you get that scene where he's kind of reflecting on the situation, where he's saying, oh, I always knew that she was going to be the death of you. I didn't think that she'd be the death of us all. In episode 3, at the end of it, they kill him off as well.
I remember the reaction at the time. People were like, no, Benny's not dead. They wouldn't do that to Benny. Yeah, it was a lot of the Twitter at the time. But really worked quite well, because Benny, he's actually a very, very brave character, even though he's kind of like seen as, the more realist one and the one that wouldn't be as foolish and reckless as Luther. But the way that he just steps in, because he's like, Mark didn't really do anything wrong here. He's just an innocent guy caught up in this, and I'm a police officer. I'm going to deal with this. It was just a really heroic way for him to go out, and it was really endearing.
If you are going to kill off a side character, then it's good to kill off the supportive friend, because that death naturally just hits the main character the hardest. Perhaps like even more so than like killing off their wife or girlfriend or member of their family, because there's something just so sad about seeing the guy who always had your back getting killed.
It's always slightly less expected. I don't know about you, but when I'm watching, especially like a grittier thing, and I know they've got family that are important in their life, there's part of me that just goes, you're probably going to die. And I don't attach myself particularly to the character. When something ends up actually happening, it's like, oh my god, wow. Especially when it isn't one of those characters.
If I did have a bit of a problem with it, it's the scene itself, like where he does die. It does happen a bit fast. There's not a lot of long build up to it. He does just decide to do this heroic sacrifice, and there's not a lot of time between when you figure it's coming and when it does happen. I do think that scene could have benefited from being extended. And this is generally an issue for me when I watch certain media. I'm not really a fan of showing a character in a perilous situation and then being saved only to then die later anyway. Or the way that they killed him off was very heroic. But I did have those two issues.
I don't actually have a problem with characters being saved only to die later. I kind of like that fate makes it quite inevitable. It's especially in stories like this, because it's like you can do everything right and you still lose, because it adds to the tragedy of it. And I think Luther ultimately is, as much as it's like a gritty crime story that takes things from, bits from kitchen sink dramas, bits from noir, bits from British gangster films. I think ultimately at its core, it's a tragedy, a really long, drawn-out tragedy. I actually quite like the idea that Benny got liberated, but that wasn't enough.
I did like the scene itself. They could have stretched out the build-up, I feel. To go back to the pair, in terms of that parallel, again, what I felt was that relationship was quite similar to the Luther and Alice relationship. One of them's a killer and the other one's morally in between. And the one who's morally in between is constantly having to cover for the killer. And there's a romantic element in both instances. And there's also, at the end of it, very much a separation between the two. And that alone, I feel, kind of justified them also having this plot line. It made it feel not like it's just there to fulfill a quota, but like it's there to be a bit of a dark mirror to what's going on.
It's always like a what could have been for Luther and Alice, which is really, really nice as a comparison. I think adds an interesting dynamic, because we don't usually see the killers and Luther working with another person. Seeing almost like enabling partnership is really quite interesting, because often the police things have partners who get to work together. So it's, as much as I've said it's comparable to Luther and Alice, I think it's also comparable to Luther and Halliday in a way, because it's almost the same thing, except the more violent one is the one mentoring.
And there is the similar dynamic. One of them is a lot more troubled than the other, and although they are kind of working together, there is definitely tension. Halliday is willing to do stuff for Luther other people wouldn't do for him.
And that she's actually quite uncomfortable with herself.
You see that as well throughout the series. The bit we haven't touched upon yet is the stuff with Cornelius. I think that what he does as a character is he kind of brings Luther almost into a different genre. This much more different kind of crime story. It's in much more of an action thriller. But despite that, though, there is still this, again, interesting concept at the core of it. The core of this conflict, which is basically a constant cycle of retribution.
Kind of builds on earlier series as well. Series 4. Yeah, there's that history and legacy there, which automatically adds some intensity to it, because you know exactly why the two of them are after each other.
We see that play out in this season. This series is definitely defined by the term hostage negotiation, because in every single episode, somebody is taken hostage, or somebody is captured in some sense, and a lot of the time it is him doing it. And what we kind of get is this ruthless guy who will just kill whoever he wants to kill or capture whoever he wants to capture. But also we get this sense of this, very human figure, like this very fallible guy who is shown to have a lot of different fluctuating moods. One minute he really wants his son alive, the next minute he doesn't really care. One minute he wants revenge, the next minute he's being fairly reasonable. See that come to a head in the final episode, which kind of has a couple of cool twists on his character that I didn't really expect.
Seeing him almost siding with John for a bit was quite interesting.
Yeah, and it made total sense as well. What was kind of funny is that Luther's upon confronting him face to face again in the episode, basically what he says, he doesn't literally say this, but what he says is, "Look, can we stop trying to kill each other?"
Sister goes, "Can we just draw a line in the sand of this?" And George Clooney goes, "Yeah, I'm with you on that."
And we get kind of a flip around again once we realize that he's playing a part in framing Luther for these murders that are going on, including the death of Benny as well. I do wonder if he's actually going to have to work that hard to be able to prove that he's been framed, because a lot of the evidence was more circumstantial than actually directly provable, if that makes sense.
To be honest, unlike other cases, when it came to his death, I mean, he had fingerprints all over the body and things like that because he'd gone in and been emotional about it, as you would be. Compared to the other frame jobs he's been in and gotten himself out of, this is relatively fine.
It's weird because on the one hand it is kind of circumstantial, but on the other hand, weirdly, because it is circumstantial, that would make it harder to prove. Some of it is definitely based on just assumption. In terms of the death of Benny, I felt that that was a bit flimsy, but in terms of the death of Halliday, you could maybe think that, and it might take a while to disprove that. We should probably move on to the direction.
I think the direction of the finale from Halliday getting shot is really well done because it's just very, very intense the way it's set up. It's quite popular in TV dramas now to go a bit handheld. Here it really, really works. It keeps the whole thing just feeling unstable and messy and completely and utterly chaotic. And the performances that come out of it as well are really, really good. You almost just see the absolute desperation in the way that Luth is kind of confronting it. And I think Jamie Payne just does a great job at keeping you in that tension.
He does a good job across all of them. Some of the best work is actually in the first episode. Because that's when we're going with this horror vibe of this depraved killer who's going around stalking women and stuff and then murdering them. The bus scene is an absolute highlight. It's really, really suspenseful. Women hearing whistling and seeing a guy in just this abandoned area riding a bike towards her, and then she's on the bus, and then you think she's away, but then all of a sudden the killer just sneaks up on the bus, and then you see a bit where another person on a double-decker bus witnesses the murder going on.
Even the way he just slithers towards her, it just doesn't seem human. I mean, it does things that really others him, so it makes it seem like Luther sees him.
Inhuman animal. And it's especially surprising to reveal that this is a guy who is a medical doctor, who also, upon looking at him, doesn't really look like anybody's stereotypically assumed definition of a killer like that. He actually looks like a regular doctor, which makes what we've seen beforehand hit that much harder, because we realize that beneath that is a deeply disturbed human being. I did like overall how this season flowed, because it actually did to me feel like one long 4-hour movie as opposed to several different episodes.
As it's gone on, Luther has become movie in installments as opposed to a television series. And I think there's pros and cons with that, because I think sometimes the depth of getting into Luther's character, like you kind of got at the start, gets a little bit lost. But it also lets them have some really, really arresting sequences that are unlike anything else on television.
It's also due to the number of episodes, because keeping it to 4 episodes is a fairly good rate, and it is the closest that you can get to making a full-length film without just going straight into 5 hours, 6 hours, or even 7 hours. The result, it still keeps within what can be done in a film length. What I mean more is in terms of how the story is structured, because it's more, I wouldn't say it really feels particularly episodic. I would say it's very much, okay, this is act 1, and now this is act 2, and now this is act 3, and then this is the final act. In its early days, Luther felt a little bit episodic, but you are right that as they've gone on, there's been a bit more of an evolution. And I would say that there's been more of an evolution in the episodic quality. Has felt like it's been dropped.
I don't think that's necessarily positive, because one of the things that was good about the episodic nature of the first episode of Luther is it let that relationship between Luther and Reed build up without you being fully aware of Reed. So, they're able to sneak in that twist as it went, and it became this much more slow burn sort of thing. It's that middle point, I think, because obviously it still has its clear episodes, Alice is back now, the next episode is going to deal with Luther and Alice's reunion and things like that. That still feels episodic, and it still requires you to know previous episodes. I think the only one that's really felt like an actual film is series 4, but that's only because it was so short. Not that halfway point that really works. So I think any good television series, each episode is half an act or an act.
Although it is definitely a bit more serialized and a bit more connected, episode 1 does feel like a prologue. It's more laying the groundworks for the story.
That still describes Act 1.
Yeah. I guess, I don't know. It's just sort of there is a part of me that thinks to myself, it does put the pieces in place, but there is a part of me that sees episodes 2, 3, and 4 as being a bit more directly linked. Because I'd say episode 1 is set up, and episodes 2, 3, and 4 are the main story.
I think episode 1 is still part of the main story, because the thing is, if you take it out, the story can't work, which makes it by definition part of the main story. A prologue can work without the rest of the story. The rest of the story could technically work without a prologue. I think in terms of the performances, I mean, Idris Elba and Ruth Wilson are predictable. as good as ever.
I'd say that Ruth Wilson is better here than she was in the prior seasons, because I feel like in this one she's given a lot more like dramatic material, and that final episode is definitely standout for both of them. I think they both really nail it, and they both give it this very like tragic quality. They really bolster the emotions, I feel, in that final episode.
I think the climax of that relationship is just really, really, really well done.
All the returning ones do really well. I think as far as like standouts go, I think the guy who plays George Cornelius is really, really good. I mean, he definitely feels like he's from like a Cockney gangster film, but I think he still has loads of charisma, and and despite being charismatic, he does still get that sense of threat across.
He's a stereotype, but a stereotype that just bloody works.
Yeah,
Like,
definitely.
it's one of the reasons why I'm not instantly turned off if someone goes, "Oh yeah, it's a bit of a stock character." I can work with that.
He still felt fairly three-dimensional.
He had decent motives, and the way you would kind of connive and manipulate was quite interesting.
I do think this show has always been quite a good showcase of Idris Elba's acting skills. He doesn't feel like he's out of it, which you can sometimes get when there's a fairly long gap between an actor who's, I mean, you could say this for any form of media, but like for like a TV show or something, to give an example, where like the actor could feel a bit like they haven't quite slipped back into the role, but I think he slips back into the role very well. He does it almost effortlessly, I would say. He just, as soon as he shows up in the first episode, it's like, yeah, Luther is back. And you're convincing me that he's back. Overall, Luther Series 5, yeah, I did enjoy it quite a bit. I found it to be a good return to form for the series, and it has me curious to see where it will go next. In terms of where I'd put it in my personal like ranking of the seasons, I'd say it's better than 2 and 4. It's about on par with number 3.
It's definitely up there. I think it was really well put together. I think it was dark, a bit frightening. It really did, again, plumb that darker side of the human nature in the way that only Luther really does. It was really good. I don't think it was quite the highest the show's been, but it was pretty close.
On the next episode, as mentioned last time, we will be discussing season 3 of True Detective. See ya.